Hello again from southeastern Finland in northern Europe. Uh, exactly 100 years ago today, on July the 28th, 1919, in the Versailles Palace near France in near Paris, in northeastern France, was concluded the Treaty of Versailles. It formally ended the First World War, although some 7.5 months earlier, on November the 11th, 1918, the armistice had ended hostilities. The Treaty of Versailles contained the seeds for another world war, the Second World War, that sadly broke out already 20 years later, officially on September the 1st, 1939. One of the key reasons was that it unfairly and one-sidedly blamed only one country among the defeated nations for the outbreak of the First World War, which of course was historically inaccurate. That country was Germany. Because Austria-Hungary, Germany's major ally during the First World War, was at least as much to blame for that war's outbreak. It was, after all, the first country to give an ultimatum or a set of take it or leave it demands to another country, more specifically Serbia, in retaliation against those pan-Serbian movements, terrorists who had participated in the plot to assassinate the Austro-Hungarian heir to the throne, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, on June the 28th, 1914. And Austria-Hungary had also declared war on Serbia exactly 1 month later, on July the 28th, 1914. But since Germany had already about 1 week after the assassination, through, in retrospect, a rather careless decision by the German Emperor Wilhelm or William II, offered a so-called blank check or a promise of unconditional support to Austria-Hungary. This was probably used as an excuse. Also, the German political military leadership's rejection of the mediation offers made by, for example, the British Foreign Secretary Sir Edward Grey in July 1914. Germany also was stripped of all of its colonies. In Europe, it had to surrender certain territories to its neighbors. Also, it was saddled by huge war reparations payment or indemnity, which would, along with, for example, the German wartime policy of printing money to cover the cost of war and the occupation of the Ruhr industrial region in Western Germany, result in the hyperinflation that almost destroyed the German mark's value in 1923. And only with huge loans from the United States could the German economy then be re-stabilized. And of course, this increased support for the extremist movements, which hated democracy, hated the Weimar Republic, which followed the collapsed Second Empire, German Empire, and eventually led to Adolf Hitler's rise to power, starting in January 19. The German delegates saw their proposals for a mediated peace settlement largely rejected. They also were humiliated by some of the leading allies or Entente powers representatives by having to use a separate entrance to the Hall of Mirrors, or Salle des Miroirs, of the Versailles Palace, and also separate exit to or from that hall. Yes, Germany lost the Elsass and Lothringen provinces or states, named in French, of course, Alsace and Lorraine, in the southwest. It also lost the upon or Eupen-Malmedy region, Belgium. In the north, it had to give up a portion of Schleswig in the Jylland or Jutland Peninsula to Denmark. Then it lost in the east a portion of Pomerania and East Prussia to Poland, so that Poland would have access to the Baltic Sea. Millions of ethnic Germans were left outside Germany, and most notably, they lived in Austria, which was forbidden to join Germany by the Treaty of Versailles. Then in the western border regions of Czechoslovakia, one of the several new countries that were carved out of old ones as a result of the First World War, the so-called Sudetenland. And then initially in Poland, there were over 2 million, or over 1 million, over 1 million Germans, but hundreds of thousands of them had already emigrated to Germany by the time the Second World War started in 1939. So it was no wonder that many Germans, even those who were genuinely in favor of Western parliamentary and constitutional democracy, felt humiliated and singled out. In fact, had the militantly anti-German French Prime Minister at the time, Mr. Georges Clemenceau, had his way, then Germany would have become a basically agricultural country, basically a vassal state of the major Entente powers in Europe, Britain and France. Had the US President Woodrow Wilson's course prevailed, Germany would have been treated rather leniently because, as a deeply committed Christian, more specifically a Presbyterian, he saw his role as that of a peacemaker. Eventually, the middle course, largely favored by the British Prime Minister at the time, David Lloyd George, prevailed. So Germany was punished, but less harshly than Prime Minister Clemenceau had hoped for, however, more harshly than President Wilson had hoped for. So let's look at the treaty now more closely. So it became effective over 6 months later, on January the 10th, 1920. It was ratified by Germany and the three principal Allied powers, the United States, Britain, and France. The Allied powers included also Italy and Japan. The treaty was written in French and English. Of the many provisions in the treaty, one of the most important and controversial one required Germany to accept its responsibility and its allies' responsibility for causing all the loss and damage during the war. The other members of the Central Powers, the by then defunct Austro-Hungarian Empire, and then the soon-to-be defunct Ottoman Turkish Empire, and then Bulgaria, signed treaties containing similar articles. This article, named Article 231, later became known as the War Guilt Clause. The treaty required Germany to disarm. Germany was left with just 100,000 soldier-strong defensive army. It was forbidden to have a military air force. It was forbidden to own, for example, submarines or battle gases. make ample territorial concessions and pay reparations to certain countries that had formed the Entente powers. In 1921, the total cost of these reparations was assessed at 132 billion German marks, then equivalent to 31.4 billion US dollars or 6.6 billion British pounds. In 2019, according to Wikipedia, these reparations cost was roughly equivalent to 442 billion US dollars or 284 billion British pounds. At the time, economists, notably a liberal British economist, John Maynard Keynes, predicted that the treaty was too harsh, a Carthaginian peace, and said the reparations figure was excessive and counterproductive. Views that since then historians and economists have debated. On the other hand, prominent figures on the Allied side, such as the French Marshal Ferdinand Foch, criticized the treaty for treating Germany too leniently. Germany was neither pacified nor conciliated, nor was it permanently weakened. The problems that arose from the treaty would lead to the Locarno treaties, which improved relations between Germany and the other European powers, and the renegotiation of the reparation system, resulting in the Dawes Plan, the Young Plan, and the indefinite postponement of reparations at the Lausanne Conference of 1932 in Switzerland. Although it is often referred to as the Versailles Conference, only the actual signing of the treaty took place at the historic palace. In Paris were held most of the negotiations with the so-called Big Four, meaning Prime Minister Clemenceau, Prime Minister Lloyd George, President Wilson, and then the Italian Foreign Minister, Mr. Vittorio Orlando, who in fact, in practice, did not have much influence on the treaty, taking place generally at the Quai d'Orsay. Which is the site of the or main building of the French Ministry of Europe and Foreign Affairs now.